All right, what's up, everybody? Wanted to jump on here onto my Facebook and do a bit of a video podcast. Best way I could describe this, but I want to do a little bit interactive with you guys. If you ever want to check out more of my podcasts or more of these topics that I deep dive into, you're more than welcome to head to kj52podcast.com. That's kj52podcast.com. I have a ton of stuff up there related to everything: music, albums, social issues, racism, church-related stuff, and plain old KJ ridiculous. You name it, all that good stuff. So I wanted to jump into this one, and feel free to drop some comments below. Would love to have some dialogue related to this. Because probably the sentiment behind it rings true for me based on interactions I had years ago, especially when I started doing hip hop in mainstream spaces. So for those who may or may not know, shout out to everybody that's jumping in here. Deanna's here, Chris Bureau is here. Nick Cannon, the guy from Wild 'N Out, from what's the movie Drumline, from Nickelodeon. I mean, the guy's phenomenally talented, has had his hand in tons of stuff, from music to entertainment to stand-up to et cetera, et cetera. I think if I'm not mistaken, just as of yesterday, got fired from Viacom, who is, I guess, the upper level employer, I should say, that his company was on. This was related to a video podcast he did with Professor Griff, formerly of Public Enemy. And essentially Nick Cannon has been fired over sentiments that he made regarding Jewish people and white people specifically. And Drew said, "Talented? Question mark? Ha." All right, that's kind of mean. I think he's talented. Anybody that can do stand-up and all those different types of avenues, I think is very talented. Whatever, that's not the point. The point being is that he got fired over statements he'd made. And the other thing I thought that was interesting is this is on the heels of the wide receiver from, the Philadelphia Eagles, Deshaun Jackson, making anti-Semitic comments and getting chastised by the NFL. Anyway, he came in. Deshaun apologized, and essentially I think he had tweeted some stuff. Some of the stuff was sort of attributed to Hitler. Some of the stuff was attributed to the Nation of Islam. If you go back on some of these statements, you will definitely see, in my humble opinion, the deeper ideology of the Nation of Islam. And some of you guys may or may not be familiar with the Nation of Islam. I've been very familiar with them for a very long time. Back when I used to serve as an inner city youth pastor, we would have Fruit of Islam guys come, and they would sell the Final Call newspaper down the street from me. But reality is, coming up in the late 80s, 90s, doing hip-hop period, you were very familiar with, or if as a white rapper, you were very familiar with the ideology of the Nation of Islam, either through the 5% Nation or from the Nation of Islam, because those two elements were very prevalent during the early 90s. And then there is a newer, I can't say they're necessarily new, but the newer faction of the Hebrew Israelites. So this sort of ideology and thought, you're starting to see influence over black males. Not that it's not been there before, but you're seeing it now popping up in statements. And a couple of those statements that you might or might not hear is kind of based on some of the ideology of those organizations. And I'll just go ahead and give a quick rundown for those that may not be familiar. Nation of Islam started by Master Farad Muhammad, or some people might say he's Wally Dodd Ford, who in turn led Elijah Muhammad, and then Wallace Farad Muhammad disappeared, And then later on, we see the succession of the Nation of Islam with Louis Farrakhan. And of course, in that mix, you would also see Malcolm X at some point. These are just some of the prominent leaders that you've seen in the Nation of Islam. Nation of Islam worship Mullahs Farad Muhammad as Allah in the flesh, but they also don't believe in a heaven or a hell. At the core of their teachings of Elijah Muhammad, you will see that one of the core teachings is that the black man is God, the white man is the devil. And if you really want to deep dive into it, you'll know that the Nation of Islam teaches at deeper levels that the white ethnicity or Caucasians were created as an experiment by the black scientist Yaqub, and thus white people are a sort of a science experiment gone wrong. White people are savages. White people are this, 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 and this. Hebrew Israelites believe that Africans, or black people, I should say, are the true nation of Israel, and that they'll even go as far as to say the 12 tribes of Israel are, in some cases, Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, essentially anybody that is brown that's not white. They would believe that the Edomites are white people. That's the Hebrew Israelites' teaching. That Jewish people are not actually Jewish. Jewish people are not Israelites. Jewish people are satanic, etc., etc. Black people are the true Hebrews. That's teaching of the Hebrew Israelites. So I'm only saying this to give background for those that may not understand context. Nick Cannon had on his podcast a guy by the name of Professor Griff, who I know very well from growing up listening to Public Enemy. Professor Griff was the Minister of Information in Public Enemy. Professor Griff, way back in the day, and this is when I was just a teenager, got in trouble for essentially saying that Jewish people were the cause of all wickedness, et cetera, et cetera. He got fired, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. So you can kind of look at Professor Griff, this guy, for a long time, has probably reiterated a lot of the Nation of Islam stuff, and he has also probably interjected his own feelings. So that's who Nick Cannon had on. And so I'm just going to read some of the statements that Nick got fired for. I'm just going to read some of the statements that Nick Cannon got fired for. This has nothing to do with whether you're a Christian or not. This has nothing to do whether you're a Hebrew Israelite or not. This would have nothing to do whether you are Jew, I should say, any sort of faith or no faith. I just want to read some of the statements that he said. He and Professor Griff stated that black people are the true Hebrews and that Jews have usurped their identity. Cannon said that when we are the same people who they want to be, that's our birthright. We are the true Hebrews. Essentially, Nick is saying that black people are the true Hebrews, not actual Jewish people. And then Nick goes on to say the rapper discussed skin color, and he claimed that people without dark skin live in fear. Essentially saying that white people who lack sufficient melanin are a little bit less. And then stating that those without dark skin have a deficiency that has historically forced them to act out of fear and commit acts of violence to survive. And then this is a quote from Nick saying they had to be savages. This is referring to white people, Jewish people, and Europeans. They had to be savages, Nick said, adding that he's referring to Jewish people, white people, and Europeans. So essentially what he's getting at is that people that lack melanin or have less melanin are more savage. White people are more savage due to the lack of melanin. Okay, that Jews are not the actual Jews, and that essentially white people are less. So I'm not putting any words into his mouth. I'm just reading what he got fired for. These are the actual statements. All right. Okay. Let me keep moving here. Let me grab a couple questions or statements that we've gotten so far. Christian Rivera says he's promoting racism. It's a double standard. We need to see it for what it is. Brother and sisters, let's keep stayed prayed up. JF Adams is watching. There's a whole group of urban apologetics who deal with the Hebrew Israelites. Steve Feuerstein is watching. Lance says religion is the greatest disease in human history. Phil Fox says Hebrew Israelites most of all think that white people are not going to heaven. All right, so let's look at a couple of these statements. So in my humble opinion, and I could be wrong here, I think Nick is pulling from several of these ideologies, but also building with someone like Professor Griff, who would believe these statements. Anyway, Deshaun, the guy who got in trouble on the NFL, had stated that, again, kind of reiterating, there's a lot of times there is the idea that there is this Jewish conspiracy out there, that at the highest level there's a Jewish hierarchy of those that are controlling everything. You'll definitely hear this from Farrakhan quite a bit. Farrakhan, again, I've been very familiar with him for a very long time. Farrakhan at one point has quoted saying that Hitler was a good guy, so to speak. Farrakhan has been very vehement in his attack on what he calls the satanic Jews, that he's here to separate the good Jews from the bad Jews. Farrakhan has stated that white people are less than human. In a lot of ways, these statements are really, they're an inverse of the statements that you would hear from those that are alt-right, those that are white supremacists, those that could, trace it back to the KKK. If you look at on any side of this, essentially it's basically saying my group is superior, your group is inferior. My group is better, your group is not. And we could take race out of this, or I should say, I don't even like to use the word race. We could take ethnicity out of this, and you will find the same thing. This has been going on for a very, very long time. My group is better than your group because of fill in the blank. Anyway, so I just kind of threw these things out there, not necessarily to garner opinion, per se, or I should say not necessarily even to say my opinion, but I threw these statements out there. I threw one of these statements out here on my Twitter a couple weeks ago, and it was just a simple tweet. I said, I can't believe that Farrakhan is still continuing to be booked in churches, because if you watch Farrakhan, Louis Farrakhan, the guy who's stated a lot of these statements, he probably almost appears more in churches than and again, Louis Farrakhan's the leader of Nation of Islam. He probably appears more in churches than he appears in mosques. When he speaks, he quotes the Bible more often than he would quote the Quran. Now, I'm not talking about what the Nation of Islam has done to rehabilitate black men or the positive changes that they've made in the community, in their community. I'm just talking about a pure spiritual aspect. The Nation of Islam does not line up with biblical Christianity. Simple as that. So I've always been curious why churches, and I would say predominantly the black church, has allowed him to get a pulpit, right? And so I threw that out there not really to attack. I threw that statement out there on my Twitter really just to garner conversation. And to be honest with you, I thought there would be widespread agreement on my Twitter. Like, yeah, he shouldn't be in there. Yeah, he shouldn't be in there. Actually, what I actually saw a lot on my Twitter was black Christians basically saying, well, what's wrong with him being in there? What's wrong with him? I may not agree with everything he believes, but he's in the fight for justice for black men. And so I can rock with that. And again, not trying to start arguments, I just said, how would you feel if these exact statements were made about black people, right? How would you feel if I partnered myself with a alt-right, white supremacist organization for the sake of upliftment of white people, and the core of their values, the core of their beliefs was that white people are superior, black people are inferior. And I threw this out there on my Twitter and had a really nice dialogue with somebody, and essentially what he was saying is I don't have to agree with somebody to necessarily work towards a common goal. I don't have to agree with everything of who they are, et cetera, et cetera. And so to an extent, I kind of can understand that, right? I hear this pushback a lot of times about white conservative Christians. I don't agree with everything Trump does, but I voted for him because he's the guy that's going to do the thing for biblical values. So I understand the idea of saying I don't have to agree with everything of what you stand for or believe if we are working towards a goal. To an extent, I can concede that point. But I do find it interesting that people will tend to turn a blind eye to these things that are something that, again, I'm only dealing with Christians here. If you're not a Christian and you're following me, or you're on here right now and you're not a biblical believing Christian, none of this applies to you, okay? So just take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt. I do find it interesting how people will turn a blind eye to certain biblical things, sometimes in the name of other bigger problems. Meaning, like, it's kind of like saying, well, you do 5 bad things, but you do 10 good things, so I'm going to ignore the 5 bad things you do for the 10 good things that you do. Okay? Anyway, let me move on to what I want to say here. Let me keep going here. Keep going the good fight. We can only see things through our personal experience unless you take the time to sit down, listen, and respect someone else's journey in life. Absolutely. You don't have to agree, just respect them and supportive of them in their struggle. Totally with you on that. Sorry, I'm just looking into some of this. Okay, let's keep going. Hi, Lori. Lori says, as a black woman, I am mortified by Nick's statements. He has a right to his opinion and his beliefs, but weaponizing them reaps the same consequences back. She said black or white. I fully agree with you. Bethany George says, Diddy, who runs a racist media company, is actually approving of this. Anyway, there is no doubt, and no doubt in my mind, that there has been massive atrocities that Europeans have done for a long time, okay? For a very long time. I don't think there's many people out there that are going to argue against that, right? I don't think there's many people out there that are going to not say that those things did not happen, because they did. And I think it's interesting. This is the only thing where I find it interesting is that, sorry guys, I'm getting my charger. It's the only thing that I find interesting is that I'm starting to see some of this prevalence of thought in some of my darker melanin blessed brethren, right? I've definitely seen people on Twitter, some of my darker blessed melanin peeps, saying, well, I don't see there's anything wrong with what Nick said. What Nick said was the truth. Yeah, absolutely. What Nick said was the truth in the sense of there has been massive amounts of atrocities committed by Europeans. Totally with you there, Nick. Definitely not disagreeing with you. That Europeans, those of European descent, have a recent history of violence. There we go. Sorry, guys. That was super annoying. Now it's all fixed. That Europeans certainly have a super history of violence as it relates to race relations and enslavement and things of that nature. But the idea at its core that white people are evil because they are white, because their melanin counts. See, the reality is that nobody has, unless you're albino, everybody has melanin. Every one of us does. Unless you're albino, you have melanin. So what Nick is basically saying, what the Hebrew Israelites are basically saying, what the Nation of Islam is basically saying, is that when you have a lighter tone European background, you are intrinsically evil, right? If you are European or you have a lack of melanin, because actually you can't even say it's a lack, it's just less, that by nature makes you evil. That viewpoint, that thought process runs completely antithetical to a biblical mindset, okay? Now, if you're not a Christian, none of this applies to you. If you believe this, and this is your thought process, that white people are intrinsically evil and that black people are not, and you don't have a biblical mindset, then that you're entitled to that. If, however, you believe that what Scripture teaches, Scripture would teach this, that your propensity for evil, your sin nature, is not based on how much melanin God gave you or didn't give you. Your propensity for evil and evil acts and sinful acts are based on the fact that mankind is born with a sin problem. And this levels the playing field. Here's why. Because what that means is that in African countries where they are committing acts of genocide, that is a result of a sinful nature. When Europeans from 500 years ago decided to enslave other people because Africans decided to sell them, that was an act of a sinful nature. When one human being, whatever his melanin tone is, says, I am better than you because of fill in the blank, and you are less because of fill in the blank, that is an act of a sinful nature. Okay? This is why I'm opposed to what Nick is saying. Whether you want to get archaeological and debate on whether black people are the true Hebrew Israelites or XYZ, I would rather point back to what Scripture says, is that those that have come to Christ are children of God, period. That's it. That's what it comes down to. We all have a problem, and that problem is, at its core, and we've been doing this for a very, very long time, is that we think we're in control, that we're better, that we know better than God. That's the first thing that the devil said to Eve. What do you mean you didn't eat from the tree? No, God doesn't want you to do it because you'll be like God. At the end of the day, our sinful nature says we want to be like God. We want to be in control. And that's really all it comes down to. Okay? Let me grab a few more statements on here. Now, here's one other thing to think about. Okay, sorry, I'm just reading some of the comments there. Here's one thing to think about. The real reality is, though, we are always going to be most cognizant of what is most recent, right? Especially in the American context. Right now, you can look at America and go, you can see where Europeans decimated the native population. You can see where Europeans, a small percentage of Europeans, controlled a large percentage of non-Europeans, right? America has a history of this. There's no denying that. In fact, I think you're very hard-pressed to find anybody that's going to deny that. But here's what I'm saying. We are now stuck in a world where we are watching Facebook 24 hours a day. We are saying what's going on. We are dividing lines and we are lining up. Okay? Here's why, and we're also seeing redefinitions of terms left and right. So this is a term that I've heard often. Black people cannot be racist because black people do not have the power in America. Black people can be prejudiced, but only white people can be racist. So anytime you might say, well, what Nick Cannon said was racist, I know some of my brown and black homies, they'll go, no, what he said wasn't racist, what he said was prejudice. Okay, I'm not here to split hairs on the definitions. In fact, I'll take racism and the word prejudice, let's throw it off the table. Let's just say, is it right or wrong? Okay? Let's just look at that through a biblical lens. Is what Nick Cannon said or believes right or wrong? Is it a belief that white people are savage because they are born white? If I look at that through a biblical lens, the answer is no. White people are savage because human beings are savage, and sin makes people savage, so to speak. I don't even like using that term because that word has been used to really demean Native Americans, but that's beside the point. When the Hebrew Israelites elevate and state that we're the actual Hebrews, at its core, what it is basically saying is we're the actual Hebrews, thus we are God's chosen people. Thus what we're saying is right and what you are saying is wrong. Again, this goes back to what I'm saying. I do want to speak to one quick statement, and I do want to say this in love and appreciation, and this comes from a heart of understanding. But I am now starting to see amongst some of my melanin blessed brethren something that I think is very similar to what I saw in a scripture that I was just kind of reading. And I'll just read it to you guys because I think it kind of bears repeating. This is coming from Galatians 2, chapter, let's see here, where are we at? Galatians 2, chapter 11, going to verse 14. This is Paul writing about Peter. Paul says, but when Cephas, which is Cephas or Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas, again Peter, before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like the Jews? Okay? Here's the deal. A lot here to unpack, so I think context is very key. The Apostle Peter, at the time of the church, was starting off, and the Apostle Paul, the early church started off as a Jewish movement. It was Jewish people. Jesus was a Jew. The disciples were Jewish, etc., etc., etc. It's not until the book of Acts then we start to see Gentiles starting to come into the church. Now, let's again look at this from majority to minority. Jews were the minority in this situation. Gentiles were the majority. Probably, to be very specific, Romans at this case. There was a feeling amongst Jews, the minorities, that we do not associate with the majority, the Romans. We don't associate with them. We don't like them. We don't eat with them. We don't mess with them. And we certainly have a hard time with them coming into the church. Because, one, they have to understand at the time, Rome is their oppressor, right? And so you can only imagine living in a country that you're occupied, that you are being oppressed, that you in some cases are being enslaved. How would you feel about your oppressors? How would you feel about your enslaver? Those that have enslaved you, those that are destroying. You would, by nature of your human nature, feel animosity to them. Along comes the gospel. Along comes Jesus, and he emphasizes, love your enemy, do good to those that harm you. And all of a sudden, this message of the gospel that mankind, whoever they were, can be saved, this starts to impact Gentiles, the majority, and they begin to come into the church. Well, essentially what happens is at the beginning, Peter's like, I don't know, I'm not going to go deal with these Gentile people. I'm a good Jew. I'm a good minority. I don't mess with those majority types. And you'll see in the book of Acts where God himself rebukes Peter. He says, don't call unclean those that I've called clean, right? And so what we see is Peter's whole attitude towards the majority changes, and he realizes, I've got to put away my prejudice, and I've got to love these Gentiles. Well, a little time goes on, and some of the people in the early church, they still got their old habits, their old prejudices, their old tendencies, and they basically say, hey, stop messing with those Gentiles that are in the church. This is basically what happens. We see right there in the early church, we see the minority being prejudiced towards the majority because of the amount of the baggage and the history that many people would say is justified for them to feel that way. And if you deal with anybody, it is eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. The reality is that God calls us to a higher standard. You know what I mean? I was about to say God calls us to a higher standard, unfortunately, because this is a hard truth to swallow, that when Jesus says, love your enemies, pray for those that persecute you, he's saying to Jewish people of the time, he's saying to them, these Romans that are destroying your life, I am calling you to a higher standard. Okay? So this is the context when Paul steps in. He starts to notice that all of a sudden, a few years in, maybe a couple months in, whenever this happens, Peter all of a sudden is like, yeah, I'm just kind of like going to stop associating with the majority. Okay? And I have seen some of my black, brown, melanin blessed people start to go, I'm going to start whether they're doing it intentionally, whether they're doing it unintentionally, whether they're doing it with justification, which is understandable. I have started to see those go, yeah, I'm not rocking with the American church. I'm not rocking with the white evangelical church anymore. I'm going to start going after this thought process because that appeals to me as a melanin blessed person. And the attitude is then to start shrinking back little by little, right? Okay? That's the attitude. Paul comes in and he goes to the Apostle Peter. He says, what you're doing is wrong. You have been called to a higher standard. Paul, I'm sure, understood as a Jew that Peter probably felt justified in how he felt. These Gentiles that are coming in here, that have done me wrong, done me dirty, that have treated me poorly, that have treated my ancestors poorly, that have oppressed me, that have enslaved me, they deserve judgment. They deserve, maybe they just deserve, maybe I'm just not gonna, I'll put up with them being in the church, because I have to, but I'm not really gonna love them deeply. That's what Scripture calls us to love each other deeply. Okay? Here's why I'm saying this. This is why I'm a little concerned when I see my melanin-blessed brethren start to defend a Farrakhan. Not that I can't understand it. I get a little concerned when I see them start to defend a Nick Cannon for his statements. I get a little concerned when I see my melanin-blessed brethren start to adopt some of this Hebrew Israelite teaching. Not because I'm scared as a white man, because I just know this runs counter to what God calls us to do. And I understand even why these feelings are there in the first place. I don't understand it as a white male. I understand it in the sense of, I can understand why you would feel that way. Okay? If the Apostle Peter can lose focus and start shrinking back to the minority, start pulling away from the majority, that means that any of us can have the tendency to want to shrink back and hang out with our group, our tribe, our mindset, and feel justified in doing it. And realistically, probably are justified in feeling that way. It's just interesting to me that Jesus always calls us to a higher standard. And this is a hard truth to swallow. This is a hard teaching to hang on to. Because we have to love people in spite of how they've treated us. We have to love people in spite of their past. We have to love people in spite of our justification to feel the way we feel. Because we have the right. We are in the right. See, this is the thing that I'm learning in my old age, and I'll probably just end here. This is the thing that I'm learning in my old age. And this has been a hard pill and a hard teaching for me to swallow and understand. The thing that I'm learning is that I can be right or I can be reconciled. And God is much more concerned with me being reconciled to Him and reconciled to my brother than He is concerned with me being right or in the right. Okay? All right. And the beauty is that Peter, you see a change in Peter when he does that. R.J. Seguin III says, "You're the only Christian that has a realistic worldview. Lecrae, Derek Minor, and the rest have lost their minds. I hope they see this." You know what, sir? I don't know if statements like that are a statement of love. So what I've just been talking to you about is the idea that we love each other deeply. You can't build bridges with people by starting off and saying, "You've lost your mind." Do you see what that statement is? That is a statement of says, "I'm right, you're wrong." Okay? A statement of reconciliation starts off and says, "Let me hear your story. Let me emphasize with your pain. And let me love you in spite of how you might love me or not love me. Do you see the difference there? Because you can be, maybe, you can be 100% right. That doesn't make you 100% reconciled. Do you get what I'm saying? Most of us on Facebook right now, or even right now as you're posting your opinion, most of us, I would say the majority of us, want to be right. We don't want to be reconciled. You know why? It's super easy to be right. Get some facts on your side. Don't do anything vehemently wrong. It's super easy to be right. It is hard work to be reconciled. Hard. It requires swallowing your pride. Sometimes it requires taking the high road. It requires being slow to speak, quick to listen. And it also requires patience, because you can do everything to reconcile with somebody. That doesn't mean they're going to change, right? Anyway. Leah Kuhn says, he got fired again. I have no respect for him after he said it's okay for him to have whiteface on his album cover, yet it's not okay for us to have blackface. No, it's not okay to have either, by the way. He probably thinks it's okay to say the N-word because he's black. No, don't be stupid in the first place, Nick. It's not okay for anyone to say derogatory words. Don't get me started. The devil wants a show today. Well, Leah, here's what I would say about the difference between blackface and whiteface. Blackface has a history attached to it. Whiteface does not. Okay? That's why you're typing out the word, the N-word, and you're not even writing it. Okay? If some black guy calls me a cracker, or a honky, or a blue-eyed devil, and trust me, I've been called all these names in hip-hop, it does not have the same sting as the fact that you are not even typing out the word that you're implying. Okay? Am I saying what Nick is what Nick okay for putting on whiteface? No, I'm not saying is okay. But we both know that if your 5-year-old runs up and punches you in the leg, it doesn't hurt as much as if a 400-pound person runs up and punches you in the face. The impact. This is something we have to understand about actions. Actions very rarely are on the same playing field. Actions actually, and words, really have to do more with the impact of them. If my 5-year-old hits me, I look at him and go, we don't hit. If a 500-pound, ginormous man runs up and hits me and knocks me down or potentially could beat me down, I'm calling the police. Both are hitting, but the impact is higher. This is something that I think white people could stand to understand a little bit, because often I see, well, black people killed more black people and there's no outrage, versus when a police officer does it and it's white or whatever. It's not that there's a disproportion in how the impact is felt. This is something to understand. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about the difference between being right and being reconciled. Being reconciled goes, I understand the impact. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. Okay? All right, that's just something to think about. Not, again, it goes back to the hitting issue. My 5-year-old hits me in the leg, I go, don't hit. A 500-pound person hits me in the leg, I call the police officer because I'm in a bigger impact. Okay? So white people, I think we could do a little bit better job in understanding impact versus equality. Okay? It's two very, very different things. Okay? Anyway. My man Daniel Cathy's here. How you doing, Dan? So here's another thing to think about. If Nick Cannon says things that, and its nature by itself, are black supremacy or anti-Jewish, versus a white supremacist coming out and saying things that are white supremacist and anti-black or anti-Jewish, both are equally on the level playing field of being wrong, but the impact is different. Does that make sense? The impact of what is said is different. And a lot of this has to do with majority over minority. Okay? If 100 people scream at the top of their lungs, the impact of that is louder versus 10 people screaming at the top of their lungs. Do you get what I'm saying? So, in my opinion, I think Nick does deserve to get fired, right? But Nick's words will never have the same impact as someone who is white standing up and saying, I believe black people are less. I believe that white people are superior. I believe black people, by nature of their melanin skin, make them savage, right? If a white person says that, the impact of that is higher because they are in the majority. Okay, I hope that's understand. Both are equally wrong. It just happens to be the impact of them hits different. Okay. Anybody else have any more statements? No, I'm not saying people of color are 5 years old compared to non people of color. I'm saying the amount of let me be clear here, John. I'm not saying people of color are 5-year-olds compared to non-people of color. That view is a problem. Everyone needs to be equally responsible for their actions. Anything else is patronizing. I do not disagree with you there. Everyone should be responsible for their actions. If anyone says these things, they should be responsible for them. That does not give them a free pass to do whatever they want. I'm totally not saying that. I am saying the impact of them saying this. If you make up 13% of the population and you do something or you say something, your impact will never be the same as if 82% of the people say that. Does that make sense? Okay? Okay? Impact. This is something that we have to understand. Impact is gigantic, right? This is times, I see a lot of times white people go, well, you know, if I said that, I couldn't get away with it. You're right. You can't get away with it because you make up the majority and the impact is different. Okay? All right. Anyway, the impact of what Nick said only affects himself and his team. Racism and blatant hatred of any race goes back hundreds of years and still has a current impact. Absolutely, man. Nancy Diaz Sosa says, fire dude, all his words were ignorant and God loves us all. He does not have preferred children. Good stuff. Chris Beal says, but it's okay to be grateful. One person is finally speaking good insight and sense rather not so much people on the famous little expression. When we see them taking one side can be rather biblical. Sometimes the impact seems small, like an earthquake, way more out in the ocean. Stephanie Hobson says, if you want to talk impact, how about the fact that riots and violence in response to the George Floyd situation has been more widespread than the incident itself? Absolutely. Absolutely. No question. No question. But have you also thought about the fact that all it takes is one spark to set a whole forest on fire? Right? If a forest is dried out, right? If a forest is dried out, all it takes is one spark to set it off. America, in some ways, in race relations and our history, is a dried out forest, and sometimes all it takes is one spark to set it off. But I would also say, in my humble opinion, a lot of that violence, a lot of the destruction, is caused by white people in those protests, right? I think a lot of that is done by the Antifa types that just want to watch the world burn. Okay, so anyway, so for those that might have just jumped in, I just want to again drop this one scripture on you guys, and I'm gonna probably bounce. It's just the idea that there was a time in the church where Peter got so caught up in sticking with his minority group, probably due to the fact that Gentiles had been oppressive to his nation, to his ethnicity, that when push came to shove, he started pulling back away from hanging out with Gentiles, and probably maybe to some extent, maybe felt justified doing it, maybe had justification to do that. Paul comes along, who is also another Jew, and basically says, look, we are called to a higher standard. And so I'm starting to see, just to a small extent, some of my melanin blessed brethren starting to pull back. And you know what? Probably are justified in why they would feel that way. I just want to lovingly say to just consider that God calls us all to a higher standard. And the ideologies of Farrakhan at their core basically say that I'm better than you. You know what I mean? That's the ideologies, that black is better than white. Black is God, white man is the devil. The ideologies of the Hebrew Israelites basically states that those that are melanin blessed are God's true people, and those that aren't are God's cursed people. Okay? The ideologies of the Five Percenters is the same thing. The ideologies of the Nation of Islam, again, same thing. And when we ascribe some degrees of support for that, I feel in some ways we are like what Peter was doing there. When we have beef with the white evangelical church, you're absolutely right and justified. If you have beef with the images of white Jesus, that's justified. Like there is great justification in that. And that's when God also goes, and now, in spite of that, you're called to love each other deeply. So that's all I wanted to say. All right. Bethany, that is a great statement. You said, who are you pulling away from? Who are you hating on? Who are the Gentiles in your life? Golly, we could all ask ourselves that right now, couldn't we? We could all literally ask ourselves, who are we pulling away from? And justified in doing so. Like, this may have nothing to do with ethnicity. You may have somebody in your life that has treated you badly, and you have found ways to pull away from them. And you're probably justified in that way of doing that. But again, it goes back to what I'm saying. Do you want to be right, or do you want to be reconciled? And some people you can never be reconciled with. I mean, that's just the reality. Some bridges are burnt beyond recognition. But I think the majority of us, we are called not to be right. I should say, it's okay to be right. But there is a higher standard that we ascribe to, and that's to be reconciled. And I am the first to admit that I have not done a great job in that. And that is something that I have got to step my game up in. Okay? All right, I'm going to take a few more statements, and then I'm going to keep it moving. Stephen Hobson says, if you follow any conservative like Glenn Beck, Ben Shapiro, you should know that the old school racists don't have the power that they used to. And you may have said my name wrong. Look closer. Overall, the cancel culture that results from someone saying that one teeny tiny little thing that is perceived as racist has 1,000 times the impact of the words themselves. I'm sorry, I'm not following your statement there, but I think I kind of see what you feel like saying. I want the killers of Breonna Taylor and Elijah McClain arrested. Thank you, Alicia. We need to pray for justice in those areas. Chris Phelan says, yeah, keep letting your husband beat you. Come on. That is absolutely not what I'm saying. If you think that I'm advocating you should stay in an abusive relationship that's physically abusive because you got to be right and reconciled, stop it. You know what I'm saying. Okay? Stop. That's ridiculous. You know what I'm getting at. Stephen Hobson says, the rioters are returning hate for hate. The public responded to Charleston with love. If we would only respond to every incident that way. Luke says, now go do the dishes before you need to be reconciled to your wife. I already made my dinner, sir. Thank you very much. All right, any last statements, or I'm going to jump off. Thank you guys for rocking with me. This was a very long podcast, but I would love to hear some things. Shelley Claire says, I feel the same way. I grew up in a neighborhood that I was mostly minority. I've always felt like an outsider in my own family for thinking the way I do. It's refreshing to hear you speak. All right, y'all. Love you guys. Feel free to keep commenting. Have a great day. And don't forget, tomorrow, for the KJ fans, TBT, Throwback Thursday, I dropped the Mountain Dew remake on all streaming platforms. All right? Little shameless plug. Love you guys. Peace.